Good afternoon from Indianapolis, and welcome to the next episode of Live with Kevin. It will be eventually in the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So glad that you are here. If this is the first time you're with us, you might not realize that this eventually will be on our podcast. But for now, I'm focused on those of you who are with us live. So if you're here, I hope that you will use whatever social channel you're in, go in the comments and say hello. Tell us where you're located. I would love to know that. My guests would like to know that as well. And the reason that I ask you to do that isn't just for me. It's really for you to get used to using your fingers, because I'm hoping during the next few minutes during this conversation that if you have a question, you will ask it. If you have a comment, you will share it. If you have an idea, you will offer it, because just like we were sitting around a table having a conversation, that's what you do naturally. So why not do that while we're here virtually? I hope you'll do that, because if you do, we'll have a better conversation. You'll get more from it. We'll have a better eventual podcast episode. So what I want to do now is do the countdown for what will become the podcast, and I'll do the live open for that. Then I'll bring in our guests, and then we'll get started. So, Marissa, this is for you in 3, 2, 1. There are many lists of skills and talents leaders need. That's not hard to understand, since all of us have watched leaders of all stripes succeed and fail. Few of those lists, though, have been created in a disciplined, scientific manner. Today, we're going to get to see a list of leadership talents that has been developed in that way. If you are serious about your development as a leader, this is an important conversation. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live, and so you could be with us live in the future. To find out when we're doing that and to sort of stay connected to all things related to this podcast, you can connect with us by joining at remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Hope you'll do those things. And today's episode is brought to you by my upcoming book, the second edition of The Long Distance Leader, Revised Rules for Remarkable Remote and Hybrid Leadership. If you lead a team that is distributed in any way, this book will give you new skills, insights, and the confidence to lead more effectively in the new world of work. You can learn more and pre-order your copy at remarkablepodcast.com/LDL. And today we have two guests. I'm going to bring them in right now, and then I'm going to introduce them properly, and then we will get started. It's not all that frequently that we have two guests, so I'm glad to have them both with us today. Our guests today are Barry Conchie and Sarah Dalton. Barry is the founder and president of Conchie Associates. He is an expert in psychometric talent assessments, leadership research and development, team building, and succession planning. He consults with company boards, CEOs, and leadership teams of leading organizations across the globe. He researches leadership effectiveness and decision-making heuristics from his home outside of Boulder, Colorado. Sarah is based in Denver. She is a partner at Conchie Associates. She is uniquely positioned to provide leaders and teams with the tools to evaluate their effectiveness and develop their leadership strengths. Sarah completed her master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology from Colorado State University, and they are the authors together of the new book, not yet out as of this moment, The 5 Talents That Really Matter: How Great Leaders Drive Extraordinary Performance. Welcome, both of you, to the show. Glad to have you. Oh,
Thanks,
Sarah, there she is. Sorry, you were covered up, so I couldn't see that you weren't there. But sorry about that, Sarah. Glad to have you both here. I have a variety of questions for you, and as I was preparing for this conversation, I figured out that there's probably at least 3 different episodes that we could have here. We're only going to have one, so there's only so much that we can accomplish in the time we have. But I really want to start with why the book. Barry, you mentioned early a couple of things about why this book from your perspective in your career, but tell us a little bit about why this book, why you wrote it, and where that leaves us today.
I think it started with being pretty dispirited by the quality of research that went into leadership talent. And there are so many people in leadership positions who shouldn't be there. And we became very concerned about that. And my business was set up to try to correct that problem. So we looked at characteristics that defined high-performing leadership, and we built an assessment that enabled us to pretty accurately predict that. And we're at the point now where we've passed 50,000 in our database. In fact, when the book was written, we were at 58,000. We're now over 60,000.
Well, I'm glad I didn't say 58 then, because I almost said that earlier, and I'd have been wrong.
Well, the book is about the 58,000. I don't think we're going to change anything because we've added a few more thousand since then. But because we've learned so much through that kind of analysis, we got so much data, we had a story to tell. So the book tells that story, but it mainly answers three key questions. And the first one is, as you think about leadership and you think how we select leaders, there's a lot of bad practice and relatively little good practice. So the first part of the book analyzes that. The second part of the book talks about the 5 talents. So when you think about high-performing leaders and you look at their traits, dispositions, characteristics, these 5 talents are the ones that capture the best description of those. So we wanted to talk a lot about those. But then in the last part of the book, it's mainly saying, how do you improve from where you're at? So given we don't have great practice, given people aren't really clear about what they're looking for in selecting leaders, how can we help them? And that last part of the book really goes into quite a bit of detail about that. And indeed, it presents a whole series of excellent interview questions that people can ask that might help them a little bit. So we wanted to make sure the book addressed those 3 things.
And so, as I said a minute ago, there are 3 different episodes that we could have here, and we're going to try and do a little of all of that. Sarah, I'm curious, how did it come to be that the 2 of you are collaborating both in the work and in the book?
Ooh, so Barry was a client of mine at the last company that I worked for. And it was very quickly my favorite project to work on, and I wouldn't let anyone touch it without my permission. He was a very easy person for me to work with, and I really appreciated the kind of depth of his thinking and what he's trying to do. But when it came time to leave that company, I had asked him to help me find another job, and he said, "Why? I have one. And over my dead body, would I let you go to another company?" So I've been at Conchie for about 8 years now.
There you go. That's a pretty good deal. Hey, could you help me find a job? Hey, I've already got one for you. That's a pretty
I've
good
already got one. I'm probably a great example of some of what this book is talking about, where you get a talented individual who might not have everything you think you need on paper, right? I didn't come from an obvious industry background or an obvious connection to what we now do in the business, but I've certainly learned a lot. And I think Barry saw something in me that he could develop. So it's an interesting story to tell. I probably fit a lot of what we're trying to accomplish here.
Well, I love that. And so, Barry, you spent a lot of time, or the 2 of you spent a lot of time in the book talking about the assessment. And I don't want to go deeply into that specifically, but what I am curious, there are some things that you talk about in the book that are that you've learned about leadership that I think are going to surprise some people. So why don't you each pick one interesting thing that you think that you've learned from the assessment work that people might find useful, maybe even surprising. Sarah, you want to go first?
I can go first, and I might point. It doesn't need to point to a specific chapter, but I'll mention it because there are 18 what we would call surprising insights from the database that we've built. Some of those have to do with female and women leaders in companies. And one of the surprising things that we found, I actually don't think it's that surprising, but the data supports it, is that when you look at the overall scores of women who get selected into top jobs in companies, they tend to be measurably stronger than men. Right? Now, overall, but if we just compare men and women in our assessment, the scores are about even. We don't see any real measurable differences in talent between men and women. But of those who are actually selected into top jobs, there's a higher bar that women need to pass in order to be taken seriously for those roles.
All sorts of possible implications to that, certainly. Barry, what's one of those 18 that you would want to highlight?
Well, on the same point, the women that are selected for top leadership positions pull the ladder up behind them. So having broken through the glass ceiling, they plaster over it pretty quickly, and very few other women get through. So it actually turns out that men are a little better at selecting female leaders than female leaders are. Now, there are exceptions, clearly. We don't want to cast everybody in the same way.
Right.
But that's a very interesting finding that many will think of as being counterintuitive.
Excuse me.
Hope female leaders who ascend to the top positions would reach down and pull others up behind them, but they don't.
So there are some things that you talk about in the book. I could highlight some, but I'd rather have you talk to them, that you think that we sort of collectively in society or in business are getting wrong about leadership. Barry, what's one of the things that we're getting wrong?
We think everybody with the aspiration for leadership should be given a chance. And the data is very clear. Not everybody can be a leader. And not everybody in current leadership positions should actually be that.
That one probably doesn't surprise everybody who's watching and listening. I'm just saying, probably doesn't surprise everybody.
I think it's right. I think it's good to encourage people, but you should encourage people according to their traits, dispositions, and characteristics. And too many people don't possess what it takes to succeed at the highest levels in leadership, and yet many organizations are structured in a way that basically says, if you want more money and more prestige, you've got to become a higher level leader. And therefore they climb a ladder. And it's actually quite ridiculous. There's no surprise to us that many incompetent people occupy leadership positions who shouldn't. And it might sound very dispiriting, but we want to stop this. There are jobs that fit people where they could be phenomenally successful, but they're not top leadership jobs. And we should stop telling lies to people by saying that everybody can climb the ladder if you try hard enough.
So the core of the book, the title of the book has this word talent in it. And often when people talk about leadership, they talk about skills, they talk about competencies. You guys talk about talents, and we'll get to what the 5 talents are, but I think it's important that we're clear from your perspective what you mean by talents. I'm going to call it capital T, talent. What do you mean by that? Sarah, can you tell us?
Absolutely. Typically when we say that a person is really talented, we could be talking about anything, right? It could be the way that they show up. It could be how smart they are, how they support their team. The term is really fuzzy. But in our world, when we're talking about talent, these are innate, enduring characteristics that are just naturally present in who people are day in and day out. And we measure them as really narrowly defined constructs and patterns of thinking in people. So an example of a talent that you might measure is something as simple as discipline and detail orientation, where you get people who think in more linear and rigid ways about exactly how things should happen. We're very organized, right? It's an example of a talent that we can measure. And when you find really strong evidence of it, those things are difficult to shut off.
Absolutely. We're having a little bit of a feedback issue, Barry. I think it might be you. So I'm going to ask each of you to just mute when you're not talking. I just tested me. It wasn't me. I don't really like to have to do that. Say, hey, you're on mute, but we just need to do that just to make sure that we're clear for everybody. I want to make sure everybody gets the core of what you all are talking about. So Barry, I want us to talk about each of the 5 talents just a little, but to do that first, can you just tell people what the 5 are? Just sort of give us the bullet points first, if you would, sir.
Yeah, the 5 talents are setting direction, harnessing energy, exerting influence, building connectivity, and controlling traffic. And these are 5 broad leadership placeholders that capture the essence of what it is that most leaders do in most positions, in most organizations. And we describe each in pretty clear detail,
Right.
in order that people can understand the essence of what it means. So if you look at something like setting direction, without doubt, that's where we measure a leader's innate talents, for example, in establishing goals and how you mobilize people towards achieving those goals. But it also includes the way people think about how to even identify those goals. What should we go for? So it's one thing to have the goal and then, mobilize people to get there. It's another thing to define the right goals. And, when you look at the way that leaders think, we look very carefully at strategic processing as one of the sub areas in the talent of setting direction. And we also talk about value proposition and how leaders need to make work meaningful. And value proposition is really, really important to many, many people. There's a reason why people aren't lining up to go and join Philip Morris, for example, and manufacture cigarettes that potentially kill people. Some people will do it because they live close by, but most people won't. So most people want to do meaningful work. And whether the work is meaningful is how a leader positions that. So one of the sub areas within setting direction is creating that sense of value and meaning through the work that people do.
Helping people see the connection and find that connection and then build that connection. So Sarah, of the five, we talk about direction and energy and influence. Those all kind of make sense, I think. Obviously we can dive into all of them a good bit, but Sarah, I'm curious, the last one that Barry mentioned is an interesting one that I think is, of the five, the least obvious from the initial words, right? At least to Kevin, which is controlling traffic. I don't think you're talking about bringing out the sticks and doing that. So when you say controlling traffic, I didn't have any of those red
Yeah.
flags, or I would have brought those with me today. And for those of you that are listening, you're missing the joke. I realize it's a you have to be watching joke. But Sarah, when you guys talk about controlling traffic, what do you mean?
There's a lot that's been written about the connection between strategy and execution. So execution is where we talk about what controlling traffic looks like. So direction setting, it's about what Barry said, how we establish goals and priorities and think about the value that we're trying to create in the future, right? But you've got to have a way of creating the right processes and guardrails around how work happens. And that's where we get into controlling traffic. And there are two characteristics that we do look at. One is around structure and process. So the need to create organization and a way of navigating all the chaos within your organization, right?
Yep.
So how do you put the right guardrails? How do you put the right processes in place so that work happens in more predictable ways? But the other characteristic that we talk about is the need for managing all the pace and complexity of work, because as disciplined and process oriented as I think you need to be, you've also got to be willing to change when circumstances require it. You've got to have a level of flexibility in how you manage people and resources so that when plans change, when surprises occur, you've either already anticipated and planned for it, or you've got a way of maneuvering around it without losing a lot of momentum, right? So
Right.
controlling traffic, that the flags aren't that too far off from what we're talking about in terms of how you guide people to what it is you're ultimately trying to do.
So of the other three, Barry, and we don't really have time to unpack all five, but of the other three that remain, energy, connectivity, and influence, to just use them in one word, which of the three do you think is most misunderstood? Like, you've worked with thousands of leaders and worked with many organizations. As you share these findings with them, which of these other three do you think is maybe misunderstood most often?
Well, the answer to that's quite complex, so I'm going to try to just distill it into a few sentences. It's exerting influence. And I want to make a distinction between what people typically think influence is and how we measure it in predicting top performing leadership. People typically think influence is getting people on board. In other words, it's a form of cheerleading. So if I can sell a story and people believe in it and they agree with me, then we've met our demand in terms of influencing others. That bar is way too low. The high bar is changing people's minds. And that starts by recognizing that some people have got a contrary perspective. Now you need to encourage that to bring it about. That's the first thing that people miss. When you're developing ideas and plans, you should welcome dissent and disagreement. Too many leaders don't understand that. They try to stamp it out. So when someone does dissent and someone says, I don't agree, I think this is the wrong way to go, then the characteristics of successful leaders don't accept that. And they begin the work of changing people's minds. And there are 3 sub-elements that help them do that we've narrowed down and described in the book. And the first one is, the most successful leaders in changing people's minds are the ones who are continually advocating for change. And they're continually talking about change. They're continually identifying the elements in their organization that they think change needs to occur.
Yeah.
The second thing is they press their case in a pretty assertive way. So this isn't a group of college professors sitting around the staff room debating issues. It's an argument. And when you've got disagreement, you have to accept argument. And, we find too few leaders willing to go there, and they look for alternatives. They look for compromise. No, it's an argument. The right answer isn't the midpoint between 2 extremes. The right answer could be one extreme. And our leaders know that, and they assert it, and it gets attention. Obviously, there are other elements in the profile that predict sensitivity towards others. So it's not browbeating and it's not intimidation. It's an argument. And then the third element is just an enormous amount of patience in working issues through with those who disagree. So we don't say, hey, Kevin, you're wrong and we're doing this. You're either on board or you're off. That's a disaster. We might say to you, Kevin, I don't have time to debate this with you now, but I'm going to go back to you and I'm going to spend an inordinate amount of time answering your questions. I'm going to, really use my persuasive powers because actually I can't afford for you not to be on board. So, it's the balance between those 3 things. And, too many leaders are concerned about breaking relationships due to disagreement, and therefore they look for every opportunity not to bring that disagreement into the meeting. And the best leaders that we see when we do the research, they bring those issues to the meeting. They have the arguments. They don't all reach agreement, but there's a lot of work done after the fact to get people back on board.
And if you're the constant advocate for change and are looking for change, and if you're willing to open up the dissent and the disagreement, as you said, and then you're willing to be patient. If you put those things together, willing to acknowledge where other people are at the starting point, you got a much better chance of ultimately getting to what you're talking about before we're done. So we are talking with the authors of The 5 Talents, the 5 Talents That Really Matter, How Great Leaders Drive Extraordinary Performance. Here we go. One of the things that I was thinking about, and you heard me in the open talk about our new book, The Long Distance Leader, the second edition of our book, and obviously, Barry, you've been at this both of you have been at this a long time. Sarah, 8 years. That qualifies in this case as a long time. And I'm curious, and so Sarah, I'll let you take this one. I'm curious. I mean, the world of work is clearly different than it was 5 years ago, right? Pre-pandemic, pre-lockdowns, all of those sorts of things. I'm curious how your research connects to and helps us think about leading when we're not in physical proximity.
I think we're still learning about all of the ways that work might change. I don't think we've got enough evidence yet to say we're measuring these talents right now, but are there others that we should be measuring? I don't think we're quite there yet. But for what we do know, I think current circumstances place even more emphasis on the need for getting selection decisions right and getting truly talented people into the right roles, because there's so much writing right now about CEO manager burnout. There's an uptick in leadership resignations. And I can't help but think that some of that is due to people not having the talents to keep pushing through. They might not have been the best fit for their roles in the first place, and some of that vulnerability is being exposed.
Yeah.
Right?
They were kind of figuring it out ish, but now everything's changed, and they're like, I
can't keep pace with it.
Yeah, I think that would align with sort of my thinking, my observation as well. The last part of the book is about changing the way we select, and you teased it, Barry, at the beginning that in the back part of the book you give us some questions that we ought to be using. One of the interesting things that you say in the book is that we interview poorly, in part because if we don't use the same questions, then how do we really know what we've done? We interview one person to the next. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And since we want everyone who's listening to eventually go get their own copy of the book, what I really want to do is just have each of you share what's one of the questions we ought to be asking. I'm just going to have each of you do that. Barry, I'll have you go first. Like, if we were to leave with one new question from each of you that we could be using consistently when we're selecting leaders, what would one of those be? Barry, you go first.
Well, I'm going to start my answer by saying that the question people ask that they shouldn't is, tell me a strategy you worked on recently, and how did you go about it, and how was it successful? One of the most inane, predictable questions you could possibly ask someone. And the reason why it's a bad question is everybody's prepared for it. Everybody's got an answer. And then when everybody gives you that answer, what are you really learning from that, other than they came prepared to your interview and they had a good answer to the strategy question? So what strategists really do is play with ideas. That's a strategist in a nutshell. They play with ideas, and they like contrasting ideas. So they might have a similar aim. I want to look at, how do we penetrate Europe as a company, or how do we penetrate parts of Asia? And the strategist doesn't try to think of one answer. The strategist plays lots of alternatives. So a good question to ask a person, and unless they buy the book, they won't be able to predict and prepare for this, right? Is, tell me about an idea you've been intrigued by recently. Tell me about an idea you've had spinning around your mind. A natural strategist will answer that question in a heartbeat. In fact, you probably can't shut them up.
Because they won't just tell you about one. They'll
say, well, I've been thinking about this, I've been thinking about that. And the interesting thing, Kevin, is they draw them from all walks of life. You'll get answers saying, I was intrigued about double slit experiments in particle physics, right? This person might be a commercial leader, but they're intrigued by that kind of thing. So a natural strategist just has these ideas buzzing around. And when you're not, you sit there like a goldfish for a few minutes trying to process your brain to truly understand the question that you've just been asked. And they might say things like, well, what do you mean by ideas, right? What do you mean?
And as the person doing the interviewing, you're already getting the answer.
So could you tell me what you mean by an idea? And at that point, you might as well just slit your throat. We're done. Okay. So that's a good example of a question that is a very good question to ask in an interview, and is a much better upgrade for the question that people typically ask.
Perfect. Sarah, have you got one?
We might just keep picking on people who think they're strategic thinkers but aren't. And when you get this book, not only do we give you good questions to ask, what we do is we tell you about the kinds of responses that are more predictive of ultimately what you should be listening for, right? Yep. So another example of a good question is, describe a great team meeting. And I think there are three responses that we typically get when we use that in interviews. And one of those is a great team meeting is a short one. So we're all busy here running a company. A really good meeting is one where we hit everything on the agenda and then we're out, right? Um, Another response that you might hear is that a great team meeting is one where everyone is heard, right? So as I look around the table, I know that people aren't holding back. But really talented leaders go a step further, and they describe a great team meeting as one where there's a real debate, there is dissent, there is argument, there are different ideas being thrown around the table, and at the end of it, they know that the outcome that they got to was better than what they would have if everyone wasn't so quick to just agree, right? So it's a different kind of environment, and it's one that's focused on the kind of ideas that Barry's just talking about. So describe a great team meeting will tell you a lot about how people think.
So I want to roll into the final part of our conversation. There's a couple things I always ask, and usually, well, I'll just start here. Sarah, you're still unmuted. What do you do, Sarah, for fun?
I walk my dogs.
All right.
I'm a serious
multiple dogs.
Yeah, I've got multiple dogs that love to be walked. I do my best thinking outside, off leash, enjoying some fresh air.
Awesome. Barry, what about you? What do you do for fun?
I destroy nonsense on LinkedIn. So unscientific pontifications from people who aren't qualified to contribute, I sometimes can't help myself. And I either attach a good research paper suggesting go educate yourself. I don't call people names, but I make it very, very clear that if you're going to post on such and such a subject, you need to do your homework, and most people haven't. I used to be an ultramountain marathon runner, mountain biker, rock climber. Those are lesser part of my life now since a few health issues cut me short a few years ago, but massively interested in the outdoors. I've also got dogs. I love taking them out. So physically active, and some of my best thinking is done on a mountain trail, many miles from people. And you just work things through in your mind. And then I trip up, fall over, and it brings me back to life again.
Which we won't go there. So there's a question that I also like to ask that I usually prep my guests with, and we didn't quite have enough time for me to tell you I was going to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So one of you gets the advantage because I'm going to ask you both. So I'm going to go with you first, Barry. What's something you're reading now or have read recently?
Well, there are a couple of books that have come to mind. One of them is by Anil Seth about understanding consciousness. And it's a brilliant book. He's a young neuroscientist, and he explores the issue of consciousness from a neuroscience perspective. And, the idea that consciousness exists outside of the brain is, of course, ludicrous. Consciousness is an emerging property of the brain. So I've been digging into that, absolutely loving that book. And the other one, I keep going back to this book. It came out about 6 or 7 years ago, and it's called Innate, and it's by an Irish neuroscientist called Kevin Mitchell. And Kevin explores the genetic basis of psychological traits, characteristics, and dispositions, and relates them to studies of neuroscience. So
which is very connected to the work that you guys do.
Right. A little heavy maybe, but I devour books like that.
Sarah, you got the advantage. So now what are you reading these days?
I can reach under my laptop here and show you, but it's called A Timeless Way of Building. This is written by an architect and a city planner who talks about the principles of how people live and how you design spaces to kind of accommodate the natural ways that people move about a space, whether that's a city or their own home. I'm also doing a ton of reading right now. I spent February lecturing at a university in Ireland there. So Barry has been sending me books on the Troubles in order to understand the kind of issues that led to it. So this is another one.
or and the Irish town. For those who can't see, we'll have all these, as we always do, in the show notes. And I'll just tell both of you and tell everyone who's watching and listening that this is one of the reasons why I love this question. People who have listened for a long time know that we get all sorts of answers, right? And I learned early in my life that when you meet smart people, asking them what they're reading is a good thing to do. It's expanded what I read. It's expanded my library, and I've had the chance to do that now with nearly 450 folks on this show. And you guys didn't disappoint. Not that there's a right answer, but you didn't disappoint. So, so Barry, where can we learn more about your book? Where do you want to point people? Like, here's your chance to sort of tell people what they need to know about you guys, where to point them on this book, etc.
ConchieAssociates.com is our website, and the book is figured pretty heavily on there. And there are links on the site to all the usual channels that you buy books through, whether it's Barnes & Noble, Amazon, or whatever, even Target, I believe. And of course, all good bookshops nearby, I'm sure we'll take orders. But if you go to the website, you'll learn more about what we do, not just the book. So we give people an overview of our business and our consulting services. So there's a knowledge base there that people can explore. But that's where you'll find the details of the book.
ConchieAssociates.com, CONCHIE Associates.com. And before I thank you and before we close, I've got a question that I want to ask all of you who are listening and watching. It's the question I ask every single episode. It's 2 words. Now what? What are you going to do as a result of this conversation? There's plenty for you to mine here, whether it's thinking about one of these specific talents, whether it's obviously one of the things that you might be doing now is ordering your copy of the book. I hope that you will do that. But maybe it's thinking about this idea of what it means to be a strategist. Maybe it's thinking about the questions that you're asking when you're interviewing and selecting new leaders. Maybe it's any of those things. Maybe it's thinking about a couple of the surprising facts we talked about earlier, but not just thinking about them all, taking action on them. I can't tell you what to act on. I can only encourage you to take action, because if you do, you'll get far more from this than just the chance to have listened to Sarah, Barry, and I. So thank you both for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. Thanks for writing a great book and for sharing some of it with us today.
Kevin, thank you.
And everybody, if you enjoyed this, share it with somebody else. Whatever platform you're listening to this on or watching it on, make sure you're subscribed so you can get future episodes, because every week we're back with another episode, and I hope you'll be with us for the next episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.